The colony at the edge of the stars was a place where power was measured by size and strength. Tall, scaled warriors carried heavy blades on their backs, towering beasts walked the streets with armor shining, and traders bragged about how many bodyguards followed them like shadows. It was a place where weakness was mocked, and survival belonged only to those who looked dangerous enough to keep predators away. In this place, a human seemed out of place. He was not tall, his frame was lean, his shoulders narrow compared to the bulky forms that filled the marketplace, and when he walked through the crowd, most eyes passed over him as if he did not matter. Only a few looked twice, usually with laughter in their eyes, as if wondering why such a small figure would dare to walk without fear among giants. The woman he had been sent to protect stood near the docking port of a trade ship. Her skin carried a faint shimmer under the artificial lights, her long robes woven from threads that reflected her high position in the merchant guild. She had requested protection after threats had been whispered against her life, yet when she turned to face the human who stepped forward, her eyes widened in disbelief. She had expected a towering guard with a weapon too heavy for an ordinary man to carry. Instead, she saw someone half her size, plain in appearance, with no visible weapon except a compact blade at his belt. She laughed, not out of cruelty, but out of disbelief. Her voice carried enough force that a few nearby traders glanced their way, and some even smirked as they understood the reason. She pointed at him and said with clear doubt that he was too small to be her bodyguard. She spoke loudly so that others could hear, as if daring him to prove otherwise. How could a man so slight protect her when enemies had promised to send trained killers after her life? To her eyes, it was almost insulting that the guild had sent this human instead of a warrior of proven strength. The human did not argue. He stood quietly, his eyes calm and steady, as though her laughter and her words had not cut at his pride. He had heard such things many times before. On worlds where power was measured by bulk, he was always dismissed before he was given a chance to act. He bowed slightly and said in a level tone that he would still guard her, whether she trusted him or not. His words were simple, yet there was no hesitation in them, and something in his voice made her pause, though she did not admit it aloud. She waved her hand as if brushing him aside, and muttered that the guild must have lost its mind to assign him. Still, she allowed him to follow, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because she had no other choice. As they moved through the crowded streets, the woman continued to glance back at him with doubt. His step was light and almost soundless against the stone paths. His eyes were not fixed on her but kept shifting to shadows, doorways, and rooftops as if measuring danger with every pace. She wondered why he looked so alert when no threat had yet appeared, but she kept her thoughts to herself. To her, his caution looked like nervousness, another weakness of small creatures who feared the strong. The marketplace stretched wide under a dome of glass that showed the endless stars beyond. Merchants shouted, customers bargained, guards pushed crowds aside. The human stayed close, never letting more than a few paces separate him from the woman. He noticed the way certain figures lingered at corners, the way footsteps followed a little too long before turning away, the way whispers carried when her name was spoken. These were things she did not notice because her pride blinded her to danger, but he had learned long ago that survival depended on such details. When they reached her residence inside the colony's upper ring, she dismissed him with a laugh once more. She said that she did not need him standing outside her door like a pet, that she would be safe within the walls, guarded by hired soldiers who were twice his size. He only nodded, taking his place near the entrance without complaint. His stillness made her uneasy, though she would not admit it. She felt his presence like a shadow that refused to move, calm yet unyielding, and she wondered for a fleeting moment if perhaps she had judged too quickly. Night on the colony was different from night on a natural world. The lights of the dome dimmed, the air grew cooler, and silence spread through the upper levels. Yet in the alleys below, danger never slept. Whispers of hired blades carried up the stairways, men who had been paid to silence her before she could finish her trade negotiations that might shift the balance of power in the colony. She did not know how soon the threat would come, but the human outside her door already sensed it. His ears caught faint movements beyond the walls, his eyes followed shadows slipping across rooftops, and every muscle in his body tightened in readiness. He had been dismissed and laughed at, but that did not matter. What mattered was the oath he carried silently within himself. He had been chosen to protect, and no matter what she thought of him, he would not fail. Inside her chambers she tried to sleep, but her laughter from earlier echoed in her mind. She had mocked him so easily, yet the memory of his calm gaze refused to leave her thoughts. She told herself that size was everything, that strength was measured in muscle and weight. Yet why did she keep remembering the way he had not argued, the way his eyes had carried quiet certainty? She pulled the blankets around herself and whispered that she would prove right in the morning when nothing happened. Outside, the human kept his vigil, waiting for the danger he knew would come, patient as the stars above the colony. The morning on the colony came with a false sunrise as the dome lights brightened, slowly to mimic the glow of a star. The woman stepped out from her residence with her robe wrapped tight around her shoulders and her chin lifted, high as though she wanted the whole world to know she carried no fear. The human was already waiting by the door, standing in the same place where he had kept watch all night without rest. She looked at him and was surprised to see no sign of exhaustion in his eyes. He nodded once and fell into step beside her, as if he had been waiting for her every move. She muttered that he must have nothing better to do than stare at shadows, but deep inside a strange thought crept in. Maybe his sleepless watch had meaning. She quickly buried the thought and walked ahead with her long strides. The market was even busier than the day before. Traders shouted over one another, guards clashed in small disputes, and the air was heavy with the smell of spices, fuel, and sweat. The woman carried herself with pride as always, yet her eyes flicked to her side more than once. The small human moved quietly, his head turning just enough to track the crowd without ever seeming restless. When a group of large-scaled mercenaries bumped past them, she expected him to step back in fear, but instead he shifted slightly and placed himself between her and the strangers with a movement so natural that she almost did not notice. The mercenaries gave him no more than a smirk, thinking him too small to matter, but his body never relaxed until they had gone. As they passed through a narrow street, she whispered in annoyance that he was making her look weak by acting so careful. He only answered in a calm voice that danger was closer than she believed. She rolled her eyes but felt an uneasy stir in her chest. She remembered the whispers of threats, yet she forced herself to laugh again, claiming that only fools would try to harm her in daylight, surrounded by crowds. The human did not argue. He only scanned the rooftops and the alleys with sharp eyes, and she felt that same quiet certainty she had noticed the night before. Later that day, as they entered the trade hall, her doubts were shaken further. Hall was filled with banners of different guilds. Merchants sat around wide tables, and the noise of bargaining filled the air. She greeted others with confidence, but while she spoke of contracts and shipments, her eyes kept drifting to her bodyguard. He stayed near the wall, silent and unnoticed by most, yet every now and then his gaze flicked to a doorway or a shadowed corner. She saw the way his hand hovered near his small blade, never touching it yet never far. She thought again about how little he seemed compared to the giant warriors standing guard around other merchants, and yet there was something about his stillness that made her uneasy. When the meeting ended, she gathered her robes and walked back toward her residence. It was then that the first sign of danger revealed itself. A figure broke away from the crowd ahead, moving too quickly and with too much purpose. The human reacted before she even realized what was happening. He stepped in front of her and raised his arm just as the figure drew a concealed weapon. In one swift motion, the human twisted the attacker's wrist and sent the blade clattering to the ground. Gasps filled the air as the man fell to his knees. His arm bent at an angle that forced him to cry out in pain. The human said nothing, only pushed the attacker aside and guided the woman forward with steady hands. She was shaken, though she tried not to show it. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked how he had known. He replied that the man's eyes had given him away before. His hands moved. She walked in silence for a while, her mind restless. She remembered her own laughter and felt shame burn within her, though pride kept her from speaking it aloud. That night she could not sleep as easily. She sat by the window of her chamber and looked out at the glowing city under the dome. The memory of the attacker's blade haunted her thoughts. If not for the human's quick reaction, she might have been bleeding on the floor of the trade hall. She tried to convince herself that any other guard could have done the same, yet she knew in her heart that none had been watching as closely as he had. The human remained outside once. Again, silent and alert. He studied every shadow with the patience of someone who had lived his life among threats. His people had always been underestimated, considered weak compared to the towering races of the galaxy, yet he knew that survival had never depended only on strength. It depended on watching, learning, enduring, and never giving up even when the world thought you should fall. He did not guard the woman out of duty alone. There was something about her pride and her fierce will that made him determined to keep her alive, no matter how she mocked him. As the hours passed, movement stirred in the lower alleys. He noticed shapes gliding across the rooftops and the faint glimmer of steel under the pale light. More were coming, not just one or two but a group. His jaw tightened as he realized that the earlier attacker had been only a test. The real strike had yet to come. He adjusted his stance and prepared himself, knowing that before long the woman would see the truth. She had refused to believe. Inside her chamber, she drifted in and out of uneasy rest. Her dreams were filled with shadows chasing her, and each time she woke, she expected to hear laughter from the halls. Instead, she heard nothing but the silence of the night and the faint scrape of boots outside her door. She did not know that danger was already gathering. She did not yet understand that the small human she had dismissed would soon stand between her and death itself. But the first crack in her doubt had been made, and it would only grow wider with what was coming. Following day began with tension in the air, though the streets of the colony looked the same as always. Merchants shouted prices, guards stood at corners, and travelers filled the walkways, yet beneath the noise there was a weight that pressed against the human senses. He had learned to read such feelings long ago when his life depended on knowing danger before it showed itself. Every step he took beside the woman told him that something was moving in the shadows and waiting for the right moment. The woman noticed his quietness more than before. She had begun to watch him closely, though she tried not to let him see. She remembered how quickly he had stopped the attacker in the trade hall, and how calm he had looked while everyone else gasped in shock. She still carried pride in her heart, and she did not admit it aloud, but she no longer laughed at him in the same way. There was a new thought in her mind, a thought that asked what kind of strength allowed a man so small to act so fearlessly. They walked together through a narrow street, where tall buildings pressed close and light from the dome above struggled to reach the ground. The human slowed his pace and lifted his head slightly, as though listening to something far away. The woman asked him why he walked so slowly, and he told her that danger was near. She scoffed, but her voice lacked the sharpness it once had. She followed his gaze to the rooftops but saw nothing, only the shapes of stone and steel. The attack came suddenly. Figures dropped from above with weapons drawn, their faces covered, their movements quick and trained. There were 6 of them, more than enough to overwhelm one small human and his charge. The woman froze as fear rushed through her chest. She had expected maybe one more foolish assassin like the day before, not an entire group. Her heart pounded. As she realized she had been wrong to think the danger was far away, the human moved instantly. He shoved her against the wall to shield her with his body and drew his blade in a single motion. The first attacker lunged at him with a heavy strike, but he sidestepped and struck the man's arm in a way that made the weapon fall uselessly. He kicked the attacker backward and turned to face the next one without pause. His movements were not wide or heavy like the alien warriors she had seen, but sharp and efficient. Every step had purpose, every strike placed with care. The woman pressed her back to the wall as chaos erupted around her. The human fought like someone who had lived his life on the edge of survival. He used the narrow space to his advantage, forcing the attackers to come at him one at a time. When one tried to slip past him toward her, the human blocked the way with his own body, taking a slash to his side, but refusing to move. His blade cut across the attacker's wrist and sent another weapon clattering to the ground. The woman gasped when she saw blood stain his shirt, but he did not cry out or falter. He pushed forward, driving the attackers back with speed they had not expected. He used the wall itself, bouncing off it to strike from an angle that caught one by surprise. He grabbed another by the arm and twisted with brutal precision, sending the figure crashing into two others. The alley rang with the sound of metal and shouts, and the woman could do nothing but watch as the man she had once mocked fought with relentless will. One of the attackers managed to push through and reached her. She stumbled back, fear gripping her throat. The attacker raised a blade, but before it could fall, the human was there. He threw himself between them and took the blow across his arm, blocking her with his body. His face twisted in pain, yet his hand moved faster than her eyes could follow, driving his blade into the attacker's leg and forcing him down. The woman's breath caught in her chest as she realized he had been willing to take the wound for her without hesitation. The fight lasted longer than she thought it would. It was not strength alone that kept him standing, but the way he used everything around him. He kicked loose stones into the faces of his enemies, pulled cloth from their arms to unbalance them, and forced them into each other's path. When the last attacker finally fell to the ground groaning in pain, the alley was filled with silence except for the human's heavy breathing. His arm and side bled, his shirt torn, yet he stood tall with his blade still steady in his hand. The woman's eyes burned as she looked at him. She felt shame for her laughter, guilt for every word she had spoken against him, and something else. She did not want a name. He had risked his life for her without question. She moved forward and reached for his arm, whispering that he was hurt, but he shook his head and told her he would live. His voice was calm, though his face was pale. He told her they needed to move before more came. For the first time, she did not argue. She followed him closely as he guided her through side streets away from the scene. She noticed the way he favored his wounded arm, yet never slowed his pace. She wanted to ask why he fought so hard for someone who had treated him with scorn. But the words caught in her throat. She could only walk in silence, listening to his steady breaths, and feeling the weight of what had happened. That night, when they reached safety, she could not stop staring at him. He cleaned his wounds with steady hands and said nothing of the pain. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had ever been. She asked why he had stepped in front of the blade meant for her. He looked at her and answered simply that his duty was to protect, and more than that, no one deserved to be left alone in the face of death. His words struck her harder than any weapon. She realized that his strength was not only in his skill, but in his heart. As she lay down to rest, she felt different. She no longer saw him as small. She saw him as unyielding, as someone who carried a strength she had never known. Her laughter had been replaced by respect and a growing bond that she did not yet understand. She knew danger was still out there, greater than before, but for the first time she believed that, with him beside her, she might survive. The days that followed passed with a heavy silence between them. The woman no longer mocked the human, and she no longer carried the same careless pride in her voice when she spoke to him. She walked beside him now instead of ahead, and when she glanced at him, she did so with respect. She had seen the wounds he carried from the ambush, yet he treated them as if they were nothing more than scratches. Each night he sat awake, watching over her door while she struggled with restless dreams. She began to feel that her life depended entirely on him, a thought that filled her with both gratitude and guilt. Word spread quickly across the colony of what had happened in the alley. Merchants whispered about the small human who had fought off 6 attackers to defend the guild woman. Some laughed and said it must have been luck. Others shook their heads and said that perhaps humans were not as weak as they had always believed. She heard these whispers too, and though she held her tongue in public, inside she knew the truth. It was no accident. He had fought with skill and courage, and he had risked himself without hesitation. The threats did not stop. Instead they grew sharper. Notes slipped under her door, warnings scratched into walls near her residence, rumors of a larger group of assassins gathering in the lower levels. She wanted to ask the guild for more protection, but each time she looked at the human and saw the quiet certainty in his eyes, she felt that asking for more would be admitting that he was not enough. And though she had once said those words with laughter, she could not bring herself to say them again. One evening as they left a trade meeting, the human paused at the stairwell that led down to the transport tunnels. His body went still as his eyes scanned the shadows. The woman frowned and asked what was wrong. He told her in a calm voice that they could not take that path, for death waited there. She wanted to question him, to demand proof, but something in his steady tone silenced her. They turned back and walked another way, and only later did she hear that a group of armed men had been seen moving through that very tunnel. She did not laugh at his caution anymore. On the 4th night after the alley fight, the storm finally broke. They returned to her residence after dusk, the lights of the dome dimming to mimic night, when he noticed the air was too quiet. The streets that should have carried the noise of traders and guards were nearly empty. He felt the weight of eyes watching from rooftops. His hand went to his blade, and he told her in a low voice that danger was here. She stiffened and looked around, but before she could speak the sound of boots echoed from all directions. Figures stepped from the shadows, 12 in all, each armed and armored, each moving with the precision of trained killers. They spread out, surrounding the woman and the human, cutting off every escape. The woman's breath caught in her throat. She had heard of these assassins, men paid in gold and blood, killers who had never failed once hired. Her knees weakened as fear swept through her body. She turned to the human, expecting to see the same fear in his eyes, but instead she saw calm resolve. He did not look at the assassins with panic. He looked at them as if they were only another test to be faced. She whispered that they could not win, that there were too many. He shook his head and told her that survival was not always about numbers, but about will. He said that as long as he stood, none would touch her. His words filled her with both hope and sorrow, for she knew he was willing to give his life without hesitation. For the first time she reached for his arm and told him that she did not want to see him fall for her. His eyes softened for a brief moment, and he told her that sometimes one life was worth any price. The assassins moved in. The first charged, blade flashing, but the human met him with a swift strike that turned the weapon aside. He moved with speed that left the woman breathless, weaving between heavy blows, striking in places that forced his enemies to stumble into each other. 2 came at once, but he ducked low, slashing one across the leg while twisting to throw the other into a wall. Blood stained the ground, yet still he stood unshaken. The woman could not remain still any longer. Fear battled with shame inside her chest. She had treated him as less than a protector, yet now he was her only shield against death. She grabbed a fallen weapon from the ground and held it clumsily in her hands. Her voice trembled as she said, she would fight too, though she had never held a blade in her life. The human glanced at her with a flash of surprise, then nodded once, accepting her choice. Together they faced the storm. The assassins pressed harder. They came in waves, forcing the human back step by step, yet he refused to break. His arms bled, his chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, but every time it seemed they would overwhelm him, he struck with a burst of ferocity that drove them back again. He used the environment, slamming one enemy against the wall, tripping another with a sweep of his leg, forcing them into each other's paths. The woman swung her blade clumsily, but managed to keep one assassin from reaching his back. The fight stretched on, longer than she thought possible. Her body trembled with fear, yet each time she saw the human take a blow and still rise, she felt strength build inside her. He was not only fighting for her. He was teaching her with every strike, showing her that survival meant refusing to surrender. By the time half the assassins lay groaning on the ground, the woman no longer felt like a helpless figure hiding behind him. She fought at his side, though weak and untrained, and for the first time she understood what it meant to stand together. The human glanced at her through blood and sweat, and though he said no words, his eyes told her that she was no longer just a burden. The last wave prepared to strike, and the woman felt her heart race. 12 had come for her, and still they stood. The human raised his blade once more, though his arms shook with exhaustion. He whispered to her that this was not the end, not while he still breathed. His voice carried no fear, only the same quiet certainty he had shown from the beginning. The assassins roared and rushed forward, and the night filled with the clash of steel and the sound of survival. The woman knew then that whether they lived or died, the story of that night would echo across the colony. A small human had faced 12 killers for her sake, and she had learned too late that strength was not always measured by size. The clash of steel echoed through the narrow street as the 12 assassins pressed their attack. The human stood, with his blade raised, though his arms were heavy from the weight of so many blows. His breath came rough and uneven, yet his eyes never lost focus. Beside him, the woman gripped her weapon tightly. She had never been trained to fight, but fear had hardened into something else inside her chest. She no longer wished to stand back and watch. She wished to stand with him, even if it meant facing death together. The assassins circled like hunters, closing in on prey. They thought time would wear him down, and that his small frame would soon collapse under the strain. Yet every time one lunged forward, he met them with speed and precision. He struck at joints where armor was weak, twisted arms until blades fell, and used every wall and stone as part of his fight. His body carried wounds across his arm and side, but he pressed on, refusing to yield. The woman swung at one attacker, who came too close. Her strike was clumsy, but it slowed him enough for the human to finish the fight. She gasped as blood sprayed across the stones, yet she did not drop her weapon. He looked at her for a brief moment and gave a single nod, the first sign that he trusted her to stand by his side. That nod gave her more strength than any shield. 3 assassins charged together. The human spun low, driving a shoulder into one man's chest to knock him down while slashing the leg of another. The third raised a heavy blade and brought it down, but the woman stepped forward without thinking. She raised her stolen weapon and blocked the strike, though the impact rattled her arms. She cried out in pain but held firm until the human turned and ended the threat with a swift counter. She stumbled, yet he caught her before she could fall. His voice was calm even through his labored breath as he told her she was stronger than She believed more enemies came at once, forcing him to fight with every ounce of his will. He took a cut across his shoulder and another across his thigh, yet he never faltered. He fought not with strength of muscle, but with strength of spirit, his determination burning brighter than the pain. The woman saw it in his eyes, the fire that refused to die. She realized that she was no longer watching a protector, but a man who had chosen her life above his own. The street was littered with groaning bodies, but still the assassins pressed on. Their leader stepped forward at last, taller and more heavily armed than the rest. His voice was harsh as he promised that neither the human nor the woman would live to see the dawn. The human said nothing. He only shifted his stance and tightened his grip on his blade. The woman stood close behind him, ready to face whatever came. The leader struck with brutal force. His blade cut through the air with power that would have shattered bones if it landed clean. The human dodged, the edge grazing his side, and answered with a quick strike that cut across the leader's arm. The assassin roared and pressed harder, his blows shaking the stones under their feet. The woman cried out in warning as the leader's weapon came close again and again, yet the human kept moving, slipping just out of reach each time. The fight dragged on until both were bleeding. The leader thought his strength would win in the end, but the human knew strength alone was never enough. He baited the leader into overextending, then stepped aside and drove his blade into the man's chest with every ounce of strength left in his body. The leader staggered back, eyes wide with shock, before collapsing onto the ground. Silence followed for a long moment as the remaining assassins stared at their fallen commander. One by one they began to retreat, dragging the wounded with them, until the street was empty save for the two who remained standing. The woman's knees gave out and she sank to the ground, tears filling her eyes. The human dropped beside her, his body trembling from exhaustion. She reached for him, pressing her hands against his wounds, though her fingers shook. She whispered that he should not have done this, that no one should give so much for her. But he only shook his head. His voice was soft yet steady as he told her that every life was worth protecting, and that size or strength meant nothing compared to the will to stand for another. She wept openly now, no longer hiding behind pride. She confessed that she had been wrong from the first moment, that her laughter had been born from arrogance and blindness. She told him that she had seen true strength in him, strength that no giant warrior could ever match. He smiled faintly, his eyes closing for a moment before opening again. He said that her trust was all the thanks he needed. When the guards of the colony finally arrived, drawn by the sound of battle, they found a street filled with defeated assassins and two figures still standing. Whispers spread quickly. The small human had fought 12 killers and lived. The woman who had once mocked him now held his arm and guided him as if he were the most precious ally she had ever known. News of the battle carried across the colony and beyond, changing how many saw the human race in the days that followed. The woman stayed by his side as he recovered. She no longer walked ahead with pride, but beside him with respect. She no longer judged strength by size, but by the courage she had seen in his eyes. Their bond deepened, born not of laughter or arrogance, but of survival and sacrifice. The colony would remember the night forever. They would remember the 12 assassins who failed, the fearless human who stood against them, and the woman who learned that true protection does not come from muscle or height, but from the heart of one who refuses to give up. She had once laughed at him for being too small, but in the end it was his unyielding spirit that saved her life and gave her a lesson she would never forget. The end.